did some very powerful lawyers. The original lawyer for Blackwater on the case was none other than Fred Fielding, who's now the White House counsel defending Bush. Their current lawyer of record is Kenneth Starr, the man who led the impeachment charge against President Clinton. And Blackwater has never disputed or even taken on the specific allegations of the lawsuit. It's a wrongful death lawsuit. Rather, Blackwater has tried to have the case dismissed. And the argument Blackwater puts forward is we're part of the U.S. total force. Rumsfeld said it, February of 2006. So we should be entitled to the same immunity from civilian litigation as the U.S. military is. And Blackwater twice has appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which I should point out is dominated by Republican appointees, and the Chief Justice is an appointee of the current president, and yet the Supreme Court rejected Blackwater's appeal. So it appears now as though this case is going to go forward in state court in North Carolina, where I understand there would be no cap on potential damages. And the lawyers for those four families are comparing it to the tobacco litigation of the 1990s, saying that once the first domino falls, it could cause shockwaves to ride through the industry. In fact, KBR has filed an amicus brief in the case, which gives you a sense of how important it is to that industry.
Have they specified the amount of damages they're seeking?
Not yet.
Now, the Marines were just outside Fallujah.
Right.
Did the Marines come to the aid of these Blackwater guys that were caught in that ambush?
No. The Marines, and I tell this story in the book, I think the Marines made a determination that that it was already done. The guys were dead and hanging from the bridge, and if they had gone in some kind of a heavy-handed manner, I think that they felt that they would have been subjecting U.S. soldiers to unnecessary severe danger, and I think that the Marines made a calculation that they had to let the scene play out, and so it wasn't an immediate response. And the Marines and also the 82nd Airborne both had been trying various approaches to dealing with Fallujah, and I think that they were trying to take what they call the hearts and minds approach to the city rather than what ended up happening, which was a crushing of the city.
If that had been a Marine unit that had been ambushed, I can almost guarantee you the Marines would have gone in.
And it's interesting because I believe the previous morning Marines had been ambushed and killed, and the Marines did come in outside of the city to do a recovery operation. So yes, I mean, I think it's interesting. There also is a story that these guys were out in the desert on the night of March 30th, these Blackwater guys, the day before the ambush, and they got lost, and they actually made contact with a military base. And I quote one source in the book as saying that when they arrived at the military base, they wouldn't tell any of the commanders what their mission was, and one of the commanders on the base said that they were like cowboys. So there could have been a lot of resentment toward them. I don't know if that personally isn't why they went in. I think they didn't go in because of what the commander said, that it would have just subjected Marines to unnecessary violence when the damage had already been done.
What did the Blackwater people know about conditions in Fallujah before they tried to drive through?
I think everyone in Iraq knew that Fallujah was a no-go zone and was a dangerous place. It had been the scene of intense fighting already between U.S. forces and Iraqis. There had also been some serious crackdowns inside the city on Iraqi demonstrations. In fact, the contract that governed their mission specifically named Fallujah as a dangerous area of the country and talked about the threat of Fallujah. What these individual men knew about Fallujah, I don't know. I would imagine that they had the kind of knowledge that everyone on the ground had, that Fallujah is a pretty dangerous place. Although at least one of those guys on that mission hadn't even been in Iraq more than a few days before he found himself in the middle of what some people would say was the most dangerous city in the world.
Do these contractors have access to U.S. intelligence?
At some level. I mean, the individual guys on the ground don't. But there is a privatized green zone within the green zone where there's some limited coordination of the private military companies amongst each other. And so they share information and they have daily updates on what's going on in various parts of the country. But I think that there's a lot of tension between the official U.S. military and the contractors. There's also indications that the contractors maybe even have better intelligence in some cases and are not bound by the same kinds of chain of command issues. After a Blackwater helicopter was brought down in January in Iraq, one of the pilots, his brother had been killed in that operation. He also was a Blackwater pilot. Wrote an article in which he said that when people are really in trouble in Iraq, they don't call the U.S. military, they call Blackwater because we can respond faster.
You mentioned the downing of that Blackwater helicopter. Are there other incidents in which Blackwater personnel have been engaged in direct military combat?
Right. there have been at least 3 or 4 ambushes on Blackwater convoys. And then I tell one story which I find particularly disturbing. It happened on April 4th, 2004, just 5 days after the Fallujah ambush. So remember, the Blackwater guys are at the center of an increasingly outraged Sunni resistance in Fallujah after the killing of 4 of its men. And at the same time, Paul Bremer was really intent on this handover of sovereignty happening on June 30th of 2004. He wanted to hand over sovereignty and get out of Iraq. And so the Bremer and the administration, the Bush administration, made a determination. We have to crush the Sunni resistance, but we also have to deal with Muqtada al-Sadr, the leader of perhaps the most powerful Shiite resistance groups, the Mahdi army. And as the Fallujah incident was happening, Bremer orders the arrest of one of Muqtada al-Sadr's top deputies. And they believe that he was being held in Najaf. So al-Sadr's followers march on Najaf, hundreds and hundreds of them, and they descend on the U.S. occupation office in Najaf, the Coalition Provisional Authority building, and lo and behold, it's being guarded by Blackwater. So on this morning of April 4th, 2004, this massive demonstration takes place. There's about a half a dozen Blackwater troops on the roof of the CPA building, and by chance there were a handful of Salvadoran soldiers who were part of the Coalition of the Willing, and active duty U.S. Marine, a guy named Corporal Lonnie Young. So this guy, Corporal Lonnie Young, finds himself on the roof with Blackwater guys and Salvadoran troops, and they're looking down into the crowd. There are varying stories as to how the shooting happened, but it did start. It did happen. The Blackwater guys would say that they were fired on from the crowd. Journalists on the scene say that concussion grenades had been fired from the roof where the Blackwater guys were, and that started the fighting. In any case, a gun battle begins. Lonnie Young, this Marine, has his heavy machine gun pointed into the crowd. He says, and I got the official Marine account from Lonnie Young's testimony. He says he has a guy in his sight with an AK-47. He wants to open fire on him, but there's no commanding officer on the scene. And so he says to the Blackwater mercenaries, "Sir, I've acquired a target. With your permission, I want to open fire." And the Blackwater guy gives the go-ahead to an active-duty U.S. Marine to open fire on an Iraqi protester, armed, he says. And so that day, it was Blackwater that was in charge of Salvadoran soldiers. It was Blackwater that was in charge of an active-duty U.S. Marine. That, to me, embodies the serious lines that have been crossed. In fact, at one point during that operation, Blackwater called for reinforcements from Paul Bremer's Blackwater security detail, and they sent their Little Bird helicopters to bring in reinforcements to the rooftop in Najaf for this day-long firefight.
I guess you can argue whether it's a good or a bad thing to have these contractors, but or maybe it's just a necessary thing. But it definitely is a phenomenon of 21st century warfare, at least as practiced by the United States. And you say now Rumsfeld has officially declared, as a matter of policy, that these contractors are integral to U.S. operations. Do you think that's with malice aforethought, or do you think that we just stumbled into this?
Well, I definitely think that the companies themselves were engaged in a very serious business plan for a long time. I think that war is profitable, and that in and of itself is a real problem, that monetary gain is a motive for armed combat. And for Rumsfeld, I think that he himself has spent his career working on behalf of the cause of privatization, both he and Dick Cheney. I don't mean to presume, to know what Rumsfeld thinks, but I know from the publicly available statements and writings of Donald Rumsfeld that this was a man who believed in running the Pentagon and its war machine like a business, like a corporation. And I think that this is very much a product of that. There's a necessary, I think, resistance to privatization when you look at government services and essential services. And I think that this administration has opened the door wide as I think it's ever been in history, to these private companies coming in. And the real danger is they're dealing in human life. They're dealing in war. They're dealing in national security issues. These are life and death issues. And when you put it into the private sector and away from public oversight and transparency, it creates a Frankenstein laboratory type atmosphere, which I think is playing out in a very scary way in Iraq right now.
But who's driving this, the companies or the Defense Department?
I think it's all of it. Well, no, I don't think it's the Defense Department. I think that the administration this administration, I think, has been more anti-military than most administrations in history. They've forced these commanders on the ground into totally unwinnable situations. This is a political war. This isn't an engagement for national security of the United States. This is an offensive, aggressive war. And I think it defeats the core reason why a lot of people join the military. We hear testimony after testimony from soldiers on the ground who don't know why they're over there. And Blackwater knows why it's over there. Blackwater is over there to be at the vanguard of an offensive war, protecting the most senior U.S. officials in Iraq. That, to me, is a problem. And then when you look at the fact that they're bankrolling the politicians that press most passionately for the war, then you see a sort of system that I think raises a lot of serious questions.
Put aside for a moment the whole debate over whether we should have gotten into this war in the first place. Just accept that we are where we are. Could we be fighting this war without Blackwater and the other military contracting firms?
I don't think that the Bush administration would be able to sustain the occupation of Iraq without Blackwater and the other private military firms, and that's the exact reason why I think there's a serious problem with it. I don't think that the American people believe in this war anymore. I don't think that the military believes in this war. And so the Bush administration needs the private sector. They need companies like Blackwater and KBR and Triple Canopy and DynCorp. They need these companies to keep the war going. And that, to me, is one of the most dramatic examples of how dangerous these developments have been. You no longer rely on your citizenry to wage wars. You rely on private companies. And that, in and of itself, I think, is a serious problem.
You rattled off some names there. Describe to me the leaders in this industry.
Well, I mean, Halliburton is probably the most famous war contractor, and a lot of people pick on Halliburton because of Dick Cheney's connection to the company, and they talk about the cronyism. Halliburton was a very successful company when Bill Clinton was president, and Clinton was a major supporter of privatization of the military bureaucracy. And so, Halliburton has emerged as the largest contractor in the war, and its former subsidiary KBR. This is a company, and the two of them together, that have $16 billion plus in contracts for the Iraq war. DynCorp is a company that is a private military company like Blackwater that you probably encountered when you were in Bosnia. DynCorp was heavily involved with the wars in the Balkans, continues to be a major war contractor on the ground in Iraq. But I sort of look at DynCorp as like the Walmart of private security, whereas Blackwater is sort of like the, it's kind of like the Prada. I mean, these are high-end guys. DynCorp provides a wide variety of soldiers from various backgrounds. Blackwater provides elite soldiers, and so you have KBR, Halliburton, and Blackwater, I think, become very interesting because they're so politically connected to the Bush administration. But in reality, those two companies are two in a sea of a lot of war contractors that are making a lot of money.
I remember during Abu Ghraib, it turned out that a lot of the people under investigation were not, in fact, MPs, but were contractors who were working as translators for the interrogation teams.
Right, and there are lawsuits now that have stemmed from that, civilian lawsuits. The companies that have been identified as allegedly being involved at Abu Ghraib, Titan, Khaki. Even though you raised that, I still think many Americans are unaware of the fact that it wasn't just Lindy England who was at Abu Ghraib, and that's one of the real problems here. It's the grunts on the ground are being prosecuted or court-martialed for infractions that appear to go very high up the chain of command. And in the case of contractors, they're not being prosecuted either. And so oftentimes it's just these kids who signed up to be in the Pennsylvania National Guard to go and stop floods and find themselves in the middle of some hellhole somewhere. And they're really the ones who are the scapegoats for a much, much bigger scandal.
So we've talked almost exclusively about the role of these firms in Iraq. Where else are they at work for the U.S. government?
Well, one last thing I wanted to say, to go back to your other point, 40 cents of every dollar that's being spent on the occupation of Iraq is going to private military, to war contractors, not just private military contractors. $4 billion has been spent on private security services.